Let me start by introducing myself, Henry Balani. I'm with Encompass Corporation, and I head up regulatory affairs for the organization. What the organization basically does is try and work with banks in terms of identifying corporate structures as part of their KYC onboarding. Are you all familiar with KYC? Know your customer. I'll talk a little bit about that as well, but that's kind of the idea that we have, and there's a whole process of automation that goes along with the banks in terms of being able to help them address some of the KYC regulatory compliance challenges that they have. What I want to talk about today is really something called corporate digital identity. And the reason I want to talk about it is because I wrote a paper on it and submitted it over to the group over here, and they said, can you please come and talk about it? I said, okay, I'll come and talk about it. So that's what I'm going to be doing. There's a lot more detail in the paper. I'm going to kind of go really high level. If you want the paper, please come to me as well. I play academic on the side, by the way. That's I got multiple roles, a little bit of schizophrenia here, but a couple of roles here that I have. But essentially, when you look at the idea of financial crime, I think we all know it exists, right? It happens every single day. And the biggest issue at the end of the day is the lack of identification. That's what this is all about. If I knew who you were, then I can identify you as a bad guy, or a good guy, or anything in between. And so that's part of the key challenge that we face in this world of addressing financial crime. And that's what I'm going to kind of look at. When you look at the banks, they have a challenge as well in terms of identifying their corporate customers. It's very complex in terms of the process they go through. But the problem is that there isn't standards in the financial services industry to address these know your customer requirements. And that's part of the challenge here. This conference is about open standards. So obviously, there's a role that open standards has in terms of being able to help facilitate and address some of these financial crime issues. So we know that, for example, open standards, they help with ensuring this secure, reliable. What also open standards allow us to do is interoperate between different systems. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the issue here is, as I said, the idea of open standards, ensuring that they're secure, ensuring that they're reliable, and ensuring that they're interoperable. Right? So what you want to be able to do is, for a bank, they don't want to necessarily be locked into a single proprietary system for any process that they have in their workflow. But what we need to understand as well is the idea of trust. The reason why we have some of these challenges is the lack of trust within the bank, within the corporation that they're working with. You as a customer, for example, going to sign up with a bank, you know who you are. The problem is the bank doesn't know who you are, and unfortunately the bank does not trust you unless they have the necessary documentation in place. And that's part of the challenge that we have. The other attribute and the role of open standards here is the ability to actually scale. Because once I get a standard in place, this kind of framework in place, I can really scale this stuff. It really is quite powerful here. I don't know any bankers in the room, but whenever I speak to bankers, I've had a pleasure of running around the world talking to bankers from all over the world, and the challenge is always the idea that it is really, really hard for them to be able to get this standard in place. I talked to a Chinese bank about a month ago in a conference, and they're saying, look, we do a lot of trade finance. You can imagine a Chinese bank representing a lot of corporations in China, and they want to be able to export to Europe, they want to export to the US and so forth. The problem is that they need to go through this KYC process, like every bank would have to, but the fact that it's so remote, or the fact that the standards may be different, the documents may be different and so forth, creates this unnecessary level of complexity. And that's part of the challenge here that we're looking at. And that's where open standards can start to really help here. So what can open standards look like? Here's a view to that. It's the idea of taking something called a corporate digital identity. And this corporate digital identity is then used as part of that KYC onboarding process, but includes a couple of different elements. I'll drill down into that in a second. But think of it this way, two major categories. Public data, in terms of referential data that you can find outside in an ecosystem. For example, the New York Stock Exchange listing. In the UK, the Companies House. In various countries around the world, you have these various data sets that all represent corporate information that can be pulled publicly in terms of being helped through that KYC process, as well as an underlying layer of private data. And this private data itself is supplied by the corporation to the bank. It may be confidential data, right? If it's a non-public company, for example, there can be profit and loss statements, there can be various shareholder information, et cetera, that's all included in this. If I can have a complete picture of that particular corporation, it makes it a heck of a lot easier for the bank to be able to onboard that corporation. It helps in terms of verification. It includes things like legal names, digital certifications, corporate structures, etc. It provides a single source of truth, because at the end of the day, if I can have one standardized entity, right? You can call it an object. I don't get technical here again. But if you look at a framework, you can look at this object that can then be used to be able to then be transferred from one bank to another bank, from one corporation to another corporation as part of the onboarding process. It becomes something for on demand. For example, we all have individual identities, right? We've got our driver's license, we've got our passports and so forth. Those are all individual digital, it can be individual digital identities. I'm now advocating for a corporate digital identity. Why can't a corporate have the same benefits and advantages as an individual in the marketplace? That's kind of the idea that we're looking at here, right? You can then begin to start to use it repetitively. But also one of the things that you want to be able to make sure is that this standard allows for the idea of having that particular entity complete, accurate, and current, right? And it's challenging, I can tell you. Individual digital identity is challenging from that perspective. Once we're able to accomplish this, what we now are looking at is this thing called CDI, corporate digital identity. It will help with the reducing data collection in terms of redundancy of repetitive collection, making it a lot more great in terms of the customer experience, as well as reducing some of this repetitive outreach by banks. I talked to a particular corporation in Sweden about 6 months ago, give or take. And in that particular corporation, this is a large corporation. They manufacture automotive parts, they manufacture cars, they manufacture jet planes. It's a big, large Swedish corporation. Starts with a V. And so the point being that particular organization has a department of about 40 to 50 full-time staff that all they do is supply corporate documents to the banks as they set up new financial instruments. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. It's such a waste of effort and time because they have to go through this process. And the reason is because we don't have standards. So it comes down to that. So I'm making a kind of an argument for the need for standards. Not only the need for standards, but need for certain type of standards. In this case, we call it CDI. Some examples of what could be included in a corporate digital identity profile, right? Things like when you're looking at the idea of KYC, this is financial crime related, looking from the top right in terms of 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock. You got PEPs, you got registration data, you got ownership structure data, stock exchange listings, and so on. I'm not going to go through all of it, but the point is that what you want to be able to do is identify those standards, those attributes that can be part of that standard to be able to help facilitate, in this case, the idea of onboarding a new corporate. Make sense? I mean, it's something that we've thrown out in terms of the industry. I'm still collecting feedback, so I'd love your feedback as well in terms of, well, what else should be collected as part of this corporate digital identity, right? And I'll be able to address some of these financial crime issues. But let's kind of shift gears a little bit and kind of explain to you how this could be used as part of a onboarding process. Now remember, banks, when they sign up new corporations, they have to go through a process. Like when we individuals go up to a bank to sign up with a new bank account, we go through a KYC onboarding process. Everybody has gone through that. I can't imagine anybody not having gone through that. If you haven't gone through that, then that's probably something else at play here, which I don't want to talk about right now. But the issue here is that when the process here typically is a corporate will approach a bank to set up an account, sure. Then the bank starts this whole KYC onboarding process. It needs to evaluate the risk. Why is it doing that? At the end of the day, it's all about risk management for a bank. It's trying to collect the right data so that it can make a risk decision as to whether they want to onboard that bank, that corporation. Once it's done that, then it can make a decision as to, well, actually, yes, I want to be able to onboard that corporation, I also want to be able to categorize the risk level of that particular corporation. Just because you're high risk doesn't mean I'm not going to onboard you. You could be a very attractive corporation in terms of transactions that you incur with us. The difference is that I just categorize it as a risk. If I'm a sanctioned corporation, and we all know what sanctions are, right, in this case, because you could be a bad entity that decided to invade a certain country in Eastern Europe, and so all of those folks in that particular country, and at least the governments, were sanctioned, so they're on a sanction list. So you do not want to do business with them. An American bank that ends up doing business with a sanctioned entity from any of those sanctioned countries or entities will get into a lot of trouble. So you see a lot of that kind of challenge there. But if I can at least use a CDI with all those data attributes in there to be able to complete that process, it makes it a lot more efficient. It makes it a lot more reliable because I know that the data is current. I know that data is relevant in terms of what I'm trying to do here. So no questions there. So the argument I'm making here as well is that it can help streamline that process. And we've done a little bit of research with a group called Chartis. You may know it's Chartis Consulting Organization that shows the benefits of being able to standardize on this thing called a CDI in terms of the reduction in time, in terms of the number of hours that it takes to lower the level of the process that we go on board. And more importantly, what it does is it helps to be able to streamline and enhance that regulatory compliance process. Remember, for a bank, when you're looking at onboarding a new customer, it's not a profit line for them. It's not a revenue generation for them. The whole process of onboarding a new corporation is actually a cost to them. That's part of the challenge here. So you want to be able to minimize that, make it as efficient as possible, and not create that frustration in terms of going through that process itself. So again, some research that we did. Again, happy to share this slide deck with you. Feel free to reach out to me. I'll share that with you as well as all of the different research that we've done. So as I mentioned, it's a positive customer experience as well as reducing the cost of compliance for the bank itself. Now, I've talked hopefully about CDI, the need for CDI. Now I want to talk a little bit about the need for open standards in terms of benefiting the KYC onboarding process, right? We recognize this is an open standards forum. We recognize the benefits of open standards. Again, I'm not going to walk through all of it, but the idea of interoperability is, of course, very important. The idea of being able to decentralize the process in terms of permission-based access. The key as well is consistent verification. As long as I'm consistent in terms of the process I go through, that's really, really key. And that's what regulators go after, by the way. There were a couple of banks about 12 years ago. They were actually penalized by regulators in the US. And instead of being penalized, I think it was about $55 million, they were penalized about $10 million. They did commit a wrongdoing. They did actually enable a sanctioned entity to open up a bank account. But the reason the fine was lowered was because they adopted a consistent process in terms of how they onboarded customers. There was a mistake in their organization, sure, but they had a consistent process that they put in place. Regulators love consistency. So if we can demonstrate consistency in terms of using standards and express that through a CDI, it makes a heck of a lot of difference. You will get fined, by the way. If you commit some transgression, you will get fined. The question is you can get fined less. That's all. Right. And I've talked a little about the idea of scalability, effectiveness, the idea of tracing as well. If I've got that consistency, it makes it a lot easier. But I think what we can also now start to think about is not only taking this idea of a CDI for just KYC, but beyond that, right? There's fraud. We haven't even touched fraud yet. There's a lot of opportunity for using that. We know that for individual digital identity, for example, we can use that for looking at fraud cases and so on. We need to be looking at corporate digital identity, first starting with KYC for banks and then moving on beyond that. Look at some of those areas as well. Remember that it's not about replacing the entire process, but really it's about being able to make it more effective and automating where it's possible. So, where can we standardize? Where can open standards help here? You can look at the idea of corporate entity verification. And here what you're looking at is really kind of standardized verification procedures, right? Standard protocols that you can use to be able to, in terms of types of documentation required. For example, business registration information, tax identification information, and so forth. Then you've got the idea of digital certificates and signatures. We've actually come quite a long way towards being able to standardize all of that, right? We all use Adobe, I think, in terms of signatures and so forth. It's interesting when you look at the history of what Adobe did in terms of standardizing their PDF. Now we know PDFs are standardized all across, right? Imagine a world if there wasn't a standard PDF in terms of being able to exchange documents. That's kind of the scenario that we want to get to as well. Can we take CDI and create the PDF of CDIs? And be able to do that as well, right? So the reason I bring up Adobe is because now, because of that standardization, we can do signatures, online signatures in terms of verification and so forth, because that PDF will be considered authentic, because we've standardized on that particular format. That's part of the opportunity there as well. But we also need to be thinking about data protection standards, right? The whole idea of encryption protocols, the idea of being able to make sure that when data is moved, is at rest, in other words, it's a stationary spot, versus being transmitted through, from one entity to another one, especially across borders, you need to be able to make sure that's the right encryption protocols that we all agree to. And that's part of the discussions that need to happen. As well as the access controls, because at the end of the day, a lot of it is sensitive data when you're looking at onboarding a corporation, and make sure that you have standards in place to be able to ensure you've got the right controls in place. I can even go so far as to say that you can do something called zero knowledge proof. Sorry, I threw out a technical term, I apologize. But the idea is, maybe you've got some folks over here where all I need to do is be able to demonstrate that, for example, I am a corporation that has not been sanctioned by a regulator. That's all I need to be able to tell the bank. That's all it cares. Think about it this way, from an individual perspective, right? I walk into a bar. The first thing, they don't ask me anymore, but typically they'll ask you for a driver's license. And why do they ask you for a driver's license or some documentation? Because they need to know that you're over 21. They don't need to know my date of birth. They don't need to know where I live. They don't need to know my hair color or whatever the case is, which is all included in that driver's license. All they need to know is that I'm over 21. And that's the difference here. If I can have that level of access control specified for that particular case, it makes a heck of a lot of difference. It makes it a lot easier for a bank to be able to say, okay, that particular corporation has been verified to not be on the sanction list, to be at this particular risk level, and therefore I can onboard them immediately, as opposed to having to go through a whole document verification process. That's where this data protection standards come into place. We need to think about regulatory compliance as well, right? There's a whole bunch around the world, for better or for worse, in terms of the various regulations that are concerned about privacy. You may have heard of GDPR, that's in the EU, General Data Protection Rights, in terms of the types of data that you can share with a business as a consumer. You've got all these different types of regulatory compliance issues that we need to be considering as we create these standards as well. We need to think about how long you can store your data in terms of minimization and retention, as well as the legal framework in which we can recognize the actual CDI, and more importantly, the enforcement of CDI if in case something goes wrong. So that's part of that as well, right? We need to be thinking about interoperability. I think I've talked about that a little bit as well. But also the idea of cross-platform compatibility. We're getting better at this, right? Because we're using things like APIs and so forth to be able to help us through interoperability, and we continue to work towards that. But I think this is something that we need to be thinking about as well. And then governance models as well, what the structures are in terms of how these models can be managed, in terms of relevancy, in terms of what kind of attributes they need to be continued to maintain, how frequently they need to be maintained as well, and the idea of audit and compliance as well, right? In terms of making sure that these are updated and current. And finally, the idea of trusted networks. Can we create a environment where there's reliability of that verified current corporate data? When we look at a passport, for example, we all trust that passport, unless it's fake, but that's a different issue. Generally, we consider passports as standardized, even the way it looks across the world, in terms of the MRZ code on the bottom there, as well as the way the pictures implemented. It's all standardized, right? Again, The reason it's standardized because a bunch of government regulators got together and said, this is what we should be thinking about in terms of creating a passport, in terms of the look and feel. And that's why we have that. And the reason that is because they trusted each other in terms of being able to establish this standard. Same thing here when we look at CDI here. You may ask me, well, okay, fine. You make a convincing case here, but why aren't there standards right now? Part of the challenge is because the standards that are in place don't necessarily address specifically regulatory compliance requirements. They certainly address things like PSD2, which is a European Payment Service Directive that really looks at the APIs that standardize the flow of information from third-party providers to the banks in terms of bank accounts, so on. There's something called the SWIFT KYC registry, another one in the banking industry that has some standardized data out there as well, and on and on and on. You can see some of the different standards out there. But the challenge is that they don't necessarily adequately address the regulatory compliance requirements. We've got groups, for example, like something called the FMSB. It's the Financial Markets Standards Board. It's a UK-based organization that's trying to establish standards as well. It's a great start, but it's only UK-based. In order to be able to be effective, you need to have a kind of global standard for something like this. Where the gaps, as I mentioned, trust and incentive is really an issue. There's a gap between that. When you look at a business registry, for example, part of the challenge of business registry is why it was initially set up. I'll give you an example of Companies House. Have you heard of Companies House? Companies House is basically a UK business registry. So if you want to set up a company in the UK, you have to go to Companies House, provide them the necessary information, and so forth. Companies House was set up in 1800s. Okay? The reason why it was set up initially was for tax collection purposes, like every registry is typically set up, right? So now what they're trying to do is they're trying to use these registries for fighting financial crime, because there's a lot of relevant data in there. So there's cross purposes in terms of why the registries originally set up and what's being repurposed for. So we're going to get aligned in terms of some of those gaps around that as well. Then there's also the idea of universal standards. There's gaps in implementation of standards across different jurisdictions. That happens, unfortunately, quite frequently in terms of not only financial reporting, but now you're looking here at KYC regulatory reporting as well. Different legal frameworks. The EU, for example, has a different framework in terms of regulations versus the UK, versus the US, versus Singapore, and on and on and on. All these countries have different requirements from a regulatory framework as well. So it becomes really challenging in terms of being able to establish open standards there. So it's not just the technical gaps we talked about, it's also these procedural gaps that we need to continue to be working through. At the end of the day, there are benefits, right, of open standards to the financial ecosystem. And just kind of a high-level chart in terms of why it's beneficial: better regulatory compliance, better reputation, improved client experience, improved risk mitigation, operational efficiency, increased growth, enhanced training and documentation. So it makes it a lot more efficient when you use this CDI process. So let me bring this to kind of a close. There are things that we need to do as an industry. What we need to do is obviously, I'm making the call to establish open standards for CDI, but what we also need to do is start looking at the gaps and the key areas where standards are necessary. We need a framework, of course. We need to be thinking about that. And this framework needs to be discussed and needs to be a trusted framework in terms of the different jurisdictions that need to work on it. We need to also identify the benefits, obviously. We can keep talking about this. I've talked at length about the benefits here. How do I actually measure the benefits? That's something that we need to be able to do. And then finally, take these standards and apply it to a CDI model itself. As I mentioned, I've written a couple of papers in this area. Again, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share these with you. But at the end of the day, I think it's something that we have to address. I've been in this financial crime industry for about 30 plus years now, and it's amazing. I'm trying to get out of it, but I always get pulled back into it because there's always something crazy going on, right? There's always something crazy going on, and so it's important to recognize that we need to be looking at some kind of tool to be able to help us improve the efficiency of it, and I think it's open standards. That's it. Any questions or any thoughts, comments? Yes, please. Yeah.
I don't have trust in
Yeah, yeah. No, it's great. I mean, she's talking about the idea of something called perpetual KYC, which is kind of ongoing, continuous review of corporates coming in. I think it's actually going to help significantly. I don't think I have the answer. I don't know. I know I don't have the answer, right? I mean, if I knew the answer, I would retire a very wealthy man. But the problem is that we need, I'm just trying to lay out the framework for what we need to be thinking about in terms of being able to address some of these things. I'm going to bring out something called KYC utility. Does that ring a bell? KYC utility basically is an approach that banks take to kind of share customer data, some basic customer data, to be able to help minimize some of those issues that you talk about. Those things always fail. Every single one I've been on in terms of setting up a KYC utility anywhere in the world has failed. Because part of the problem is exactly what you talked about. Again, I think it boils down to the lack of open standards. The lack of standards of being able to establish that, being able to trust that these are the standards that we want to use for KYC to hopefully help solve that problem. Is it going to be solved in the next 5 years? Probably not. Next 10 years? Probably not. I don't know. Right? But I think it's something that we need to come to think about. Yes, please. Yeah. So you've got the banks and you've got the corporations. Okay? And the government, exactly, yeah. So those are three major groups that need to interact with each other, right? So let's start with the banks, right? What the banks are looking for is being able to make this process as efficient as possible, okay? Because for them, this is a cost center. For them, it's about, I got to do this. If I don't do it, the regulator is going to nail me. That's really all it is, right? So that's from that perspective. When you look at the regulators themselves, they don't necessarily give the rat's ass, excuse my French, in terms of being how the banks go about doing it, as long as they do it. I don't care if you use a spreadsheet. I don't care if you use an abacus or stone tablet or the latest, fanciest technology. As long as, number one, you're consistent and the output is reliable. That's part of the kind of the approach. So you got that, right? And then you got the corporation say, wait a minute, I'm the customer here. You should be able to work with me in terms of what I need versus what you need. So these are misaligned in terms of all the expectations, all the requirements. And so that's part of the area that we need to be thinking about, need to have those discussions to be able to at least align some of those approaches that they have. That will hopefully create more efficiency. Hopefully I've addressed that question partially. Again, I don't have the full answer, unfortunately, because this is a fairly complex topic. But we can use at least standards expressed through the CDI. I think we have a shot at solving the problem. Any other thoughts, comments? Great. Well, I know we're supposed to stop at 4:15, which is 4:15. So thank you for attending, and please, as I said, reach out to me, and happy to have further discussions.